We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Government Affairs Director here at Public Policy Institute of California. See, it's my first day back to this event. This is our first event here, and it's going to be hard for me, apparently. So we want to welcome you here to the Event Center. And for those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit with offices both here in Sacramento and San Francisco. For today's presentation, we're going to hear from PPIC researcher Luna Lopez, who will be presenting the findings of PPIC's latest survey on Californians and their government. We'd like to thank the James Irvine Foundation, the California Endowment, and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of this particular survey. We'd also like to thank PPIC's Corporate Circle and PPIC's Donor Circle for help in making this event possible and for our delicious lunch. At registration, you should have received documents that contain some key findings about today's survey. The full survey and the slides that you're about to see are already available online at ppic.org. And a few more things before we get started. Our next event, which will feature new research from PPIC's Higher Education Center team titled Reforming English Pathways at California's Community Colleges, will take place on February 28th. There'll be a presentation and a great panel, and we hope you'll check it out online. We'll be over at the California Endowment for the first time, which is located just behind the Convention Center, so I hope you'll find your way over there. Later today, you'll receive a survey, because we love surveys, about the survey presentation, so please fill that out. We do look at those surveys, and we do make adjustments based on those. And finally, please turn off your cell phones or silence them. Dare I say that this is the beginning of the formal election season. We are just a little under 4 months from the June 6th primary. I know, scary, right? Okay, so it's going to be good. Today's polls looked at candidates for the governor and the U.S. Senate, starting with the race for governor. Our December frontrunner, Don't Know, lost some support. In December, Don't Know was there at 30 points. This poll shows a virtual tie between former mayors Newsom and Villaraigosa and Don't Know, around 21 and 24. In a top two primary state, it's interesting to note that the three Republican candidates' combined totals add up to 18. I suspect the Republican candidates noticed this because at a recent debate, each candidate asked the other to drop out. From all reports, they politely declined. So we'll see. But we don't know. The filing deadline is March 9th, and that's when we'll know who is actually going to be a candidate for governor, a former candidate to governor. And at the same time, we'll know their official ballot designation. We get a lot of responses about our polls, but one of the things we get a lot of criticism about is our ballot designation before they formally designate. So for those campaign consultants who are going to argue that being called the mayor from LA doesn't make you popular in the Bay Area, and vice versa, just be happy we didn't use fan of Dodgers or the Giants, because that would have really skewed our polls. You have a way, campaigns, to fix this. In March, you get to use your preferred designation, so you have the power. Today's news stories about our poll dove nicely into what I love to tell people about our poll, is that we have our crosstabs available online. And I recommend looking at these crosstabs because they tell a richer story about the survey. The first thing that struck me in the poll is that it was dominated by the importance of the Latino voter and issues. Villaraigosa's stronger showing in our January poll is driven by Latino voters. Villaraigosa led Newsom among Latinos by 35 points. And in the race for the U.S. Senate, incumbent Dianne Feinstein is leading her challenger by 46 to 17, and Latinos supported her 47 to 29%. The number one issue that Californians think the governor and the legislature should work on is immigration. And in a rare bipartisan position, 81% of likely voters in California, including 58% of Republicans, think DACA residents should retain legal status. In addition to these kind of issues, we actually polled on some ballot questions, and you'll start to see more of this. I want to note there are still 42 initiatives being circulated, so you may have a lot of opportunity or a little, depending on how the signature gathering goes. Today, our poll looks at the repeal of the gas tax and the split roll. The gas tax issue will play out in both the June and November election. It is tied to the pending recall vote of State Senator Josh Newman. Our poll shows lower support for the repeal than in previous polls. However, a majority of voters in Los Angeles and Orange County, where the recall election will take place, are more likely to support the repeal than other parts of the state. Republicans who are hoping that the opposition to the gas tax would drive more conservative voters to the polls may be disappointed in the lower numbers that they see in this poll. And finally, gas prices remain pretty low right now, but there is a suggestion and a forecast that they may go up this summer. The second question we asked is on the split roll. It's the 40th anniversary of Prop 13. And so there's a number of measures that are being circulated to reform or replace, in some cases, Prop 13. The split roll is something we pulled on previously, and our support for it was at the lowest level since we started to poll on it. So that's a really interesting thing, and I'm sure Luna will be able to give us some insights on that. There are so many other important issues in this poll, including the continuing sexual harassment scandals, which I will not comment about here, because as a former legislative staffer, it touches very close to home. But I'd like to now invite Luna up so that she can present some important findings.
Great, thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for being here today. I first want to just thank my co-authors, PPIC President and Survey Director Mark Baldassari, our Associate Survey Director Dean Bonner, Research Associate Alyssa Dykman. So just a quick outline of what we're going to go through here. I'm just going to give a preview or just kind of some summary of PPIC statewide surveys for those of you who might not be that familiar with our survey series. The first section of the presentation is going to cover findings on the questions that have to do with the 2018 upcoming election, and then I'll take some questions on those topics after I finish that section. Then I'll go ahead and cover the findings on some more general state and national issues that we asked about, and then kind of summary up with the conclusions, and then open it up to questions again if we have some additional time. So the mission of the PPIC statewide survey is to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan information on political, social, and economic issues and opinions in the state. Our goal is really to inform and improve the state policymaking process and provide a voice for all Californians in the in policy debates. And so since 1998, we've interviewed over 330,000 Californians, and we've conducted over 160 surveys that have covered regional surveys, general surveys on a variety of topics, and kind of issue-specific surveys like our K-12 survey and our higher education survey and our survey on the environment. So this survey that we're going to be kind of covering today, it was fielded during January 21st to the 30th. We've recently increased the proportion of calls that we do on cell phone. So 70% of the interviews were completed with a cell phone respondent, 30% on landline. It includes 1,700 California adults. Of that, 1,042 were designated as likely voters. And the issues that we're going to cover today are kind of views on the gubernatorial and U.S. Senate elections coming up, and the candidates, and opinions on state and federal elected officials, approval ratings, the state budget, sexual harassment in the state legislature, and we also have some questions on immigration policy. So turning first to kind of the questions on the upcoming election. So the first thing I'd note is that very few Californians are paying attention right now. So we asked if they're paying how closely they're following news about the gubernatorial candidates, and only 7% said that they're following news about the gubernatorial candidates very closely. Another 23% say fairly closely. So that's just 3 in 10 Californians say that they're paying attention, really like following news about the candidates. So given that lack of kind of attention that's being paid right now to the campaign, we see that 24% of Californians say they don't know when we ask them who they're going to vote for in the gubernatorial primary. That said, these numbers are pretty similar to what we found in December. Today, Gavin Newsom is at 23. He was at 23 in our December survey. Antonio Villaraigosa is at 21. He was at 18, so very, very slight uptick there. And the rest of the candidates are kind of similar to what we saw in December. I'll say that in December, Doug Ose was not included in that poll because he hadn't officially announced yet. So we did include him in this month's survey. So we also asked Californians if they're, in general, if they're satisfied with the choices of candidates that they have in the upcoming primary election. And we see that 54% of, majority of likely voters are satisfied. But that kind of masks an underlying partisan divide there. You see 71% of Democrats say that they're satisfied with their choices of candidates, compared to only 38% of Republicans and 44% of independents. So, when you look at that top line number, majority, 54% are satisfied, it really, when you look a little deeper and you look at those partisan numbers, there's a pretty wide gap there. And you can also see that here Latinos are more likely than whites and other racial groups to say that they're satisfied with the choices of candidates that they have in the gubernatorial primary. So before we ask the matchup, the kind of horse race question, who would you vote for in the primary, we kind of gauge the favorability of each candidate. And this is actually the question in which we provide their kind of commonly used titles, because they're kind of formal official titles that that's going to be on the ballot have not been formally announced yet. So here we see that the favorability for the candidates very similar to what we found in December. Not a lot of deviation, real change. The one candidate that saw a slight increase compared to December was Antonio Villaraigosa. He was at 31% favorable. Now he's at 40% favorable, right in line with Gavin Newsom. And I think the real takeaway here is that majorities of likely voters have either never heard of or just don't know enough about, Travis Allen, John Chung, John Cox, Delaney Easton, or Doug Ose. So really, the name recognition of those candidates is still pretty low, with majority saying that they just either have never heard of them or don't know enough about them to really have an opinion. So turning to the Senate race, Dianne Feinstein still, continues to lead Kevin De Leon. Right now, we have her leading by 29 points. Notable here is a third of California likely voters say they don't know who they're going to vote for in the Senate primary. And without a prominent Republican in the race, a real notable number there is that don't know number for Republican likely voters is 65%. So Republicans really don't know who to go for, and if kind of looking back at the kind of top two, when you end up having two prominent Democrats that make it into the top two, we see a lot of drop off in the general, with Republicans kind of not voting in that race. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here in the primary. Similar to what we do with the gubernatorial candidates, before asking the kind of horse race question, we ask about candidate favorabilities. And here we have today 52% of California likely voters have a favorable view of Dianne Feinstein. 38% have an unfavorable opinion of her. With Kevin De Leon, we have 16% having a favorable opinion, 19% unfavorable. But really the key there is that 45% of likely voters say they've never heard of Kevin De Leon, and another 19% say they don't know enough about him to really have an opinion. So, and just notably there, this includes 53% of Latinos who say they either have never heard of or don't know enough about Kevin De Leon to have an opinion. So next, we asked some questions about candidate experience and candidate qualities. So we asked which of these is most important to you, that a candidate has experience in elected office or that a candidate has experience running a business. And what we found is that today 62% of Californians prefer a candidate who has experience in elected office. And this is the highest point since first began asking this question in 1998. And as you can see, it's notable change from 2010 when we were in the middle of the Brown-Whitman race. So it's a pretty notable increase there. That said, there are some partisan differences, right? So overwhelming majority of Democrats, 84%, prefer experience in elected office, whereas solid majority of Republicans, 65%, prefer experience running a business. And among independents, they're more likely to prefer experience in elected office than experience running a business. We also asked, which of these are kind of the most important to you? Is it the candidate's stance on the issues, their experience, their character, or the candidate's political party? And we found that 6 in 10 likely voters say that it's the stands on the issues that really is the most important thing to them when they're thinking about voting for a statewide candidate such as governor or Senate. And one thing that is pretty notable here is we don't see that partisan difference that we see here with the experience question. We don't see that in this question. So it's 57% of Democrats, 61% of Republicans, and 61% of independents all say that it's the candidate stands on the issues that is most important to them. And these results are pretty similar to what we found in when we first asked this question in 1998. So next, we tried to cover, lightly touch in a general sense, 2 issues that may be coming up on the ballot via the initiative process. So we asked Californians if they, are in favor or opposed to repealing the recent increase in the gas tax. And we found that right now, likely voters are divided. 47% are in favor, 48% are opposed. And here we have a majority of Democrats, 56%, who would oppose a repeal. 61% of Republicans would favor a repeal of the recent gas tax increase. And independents are slightly more likely to favor a repeal than to oppose. So we also, as Deborah mentioned, we asked about the split roll. So when California likely voters were asked about taxing commercial properties at the current market rate, we found, again, likely voters are divided on this issue. 46% are in favor of having commercial properties taxed at their current market rate. 43% are opposed. And here we have a slight majority of Democrats, 53%. Are in favor of that change, whereas 56% of Republicans are opposed. And independents are pretty divided, though 45% favor and 39% oppose. And as Deborah mentioned, this is the lowest level of support for the kind of split roll idea since we first began asking about it in 2012. Okay, are there any questions about the kind of election stuff? You can always ask them later too if you have them, but if anybody has any questions now about the gubernatorial race, Senate race, or any of the questions we've just covered? Yeah?
On the initiative, the gas tax one, one of the things is, do you think it would, how much a difference would have made if you would also included the VLF fee?
Yeah, we tried to go pretty general with this. So in December, we actually asked about how important is this issue to you, right? And we tried to keep it pretty general. We do have a question later on that I'm going to cover in the budget, which talks about taking the funds from the increase in the gas tax and vehicle fee. And you'll see that there's a pretty broad support for spending that money. But as you can see, when it comes to whether we should repeal it, there's some differences there. But yeah, we try to keep it as general and short as possible, though.
I'm just curious, what's the highest level of support you've seen for the split roll?
So we've had it in the 50, low 50s, I think. I don't know if we've ever crossed into the 60s. I'd have to double check that. But yeah, it's always been kind of, in that upper 40s to kind of mid 50s range, if I can recall.
You touched on this a little bit, the drop-off of voters at the top of the ticket when there's probably not going to be a Republican running for Senate. Are you planning on asking any questions about, Republican identifying people not voting to sort of predict that?
We'll see. I mean, as we get further along in our surveys, they're going to kind of follow the general, and we have a few more also before the primary. We might, the hard thing is we always have, there's too many things we want to ask, right, and not enough kind of time to ask them. As you can imagine, it's hard to keep people on the phone for 20 minutes. So it's kind of a trade-off. It's something that we've definitely looked into, and I know some of our other researchers have looked at, from an administrative data perspective, looking at turnout among Republicans and drop-offs and things like that. So, any other questions? Okay, let's jump into the state and national issues. And again, if you have questions from the first section at the end, please feel free to ask them then. So, so turning to kind of state and national issues, we looked at the approval ratings of federal elected officials, and then I'll cover the approval ratings of our state elected officials. So after 1 year in office, President Trump's approval rating remains pretty low. Today, 26% of Californians approve of the way the president is handling his job. 71% disapprove. And it's been pretty stable, you see, since January of last year. A recent Gallup survey of adults nationwide found 38% approve of the job President Trump is doing. So, Californians are less likely than adults nationwide to really approve of the president. And as you can imagine, we have some pretty notable partisan differences here. So only 7% of Democrats approve of the job President Trump is doing, compared to 72% of Republicans. So, and independents, 31% approve. So, there's also some pretty notable differences among racial ethnic groups. So 41% of whites approve of the job President Trump is doing, compared to 23% of Asian Americans, 12% of Latinos, and 6% of African Americans. So looking at Congress, they also have a pretty low approval rating. As you can see, 21% of Californians approve of the job the U.S. Congress is doing. Now here, you don't see those same levels of partisan differences, right? So approval of Congress is low across parties. So that's something we can, I guess, all get behind there. And we have 18% in recent national CNN poll found that 18% of adults nationwide approve of Congress. So, it's not just California. Adults nationwide also have a pretty low approval of the U.S. Congress at this moment. So, this is a big change from that. So, this is the approval of state elected officials. And here we find that today, majority of 56% approve of the job Governor Brown's doing. And this was similar to what we found in December. It was slightly higher in last January, 62% approved then. But especially when compared to our federal elected officials, you see a big difference there. And that said, there are some, again, partisan differences here. 76% of Democrats approve of the Governor Brown, compared to only 26% of Republicans, and independents are at 47%. And when we look at the state legislature, half, 51%, approve of the job the California state legislature is doing, And this is similar to what we found in December and to what we found last January. And again, we have really similar partisan differences that we see with Governor Brown here, with 69% of Democrats approving of the job the legislature is doing, compared to only a quarter of Republicans and 37% of independents. So we ask this question, we like to ask this in January, which is, do you think that Governor Brown and the state legislature will be able to work together and accomplish a lot in the next year? And we also asked this of President Trump and the US Congress. And here you see a pretty big difference, right? So 60% of Californians think that the governor and the state legislature will be able to work together and accomplish a lot, and 67% think that the president and Congress will not be able to do that. So it's really kind of mirror images here. That said, we have some partisan differences. When it comes to the governor and the legislature working together and accomplishing a lot, 75% of Democrats think that they'll be able to do so, compared to only 36% of Republicans. When it comes to the president and Congress, only 12% of Democrats think that they'll be able to work together and accomplish a lot, compared to 58% of Republicans. So again, we're seeing kind of these mirror images in terms of the parties and state and federal kind of cooperation here. So in January, we ask an open-ended question of respondents, which is what one issue facing California today do you think is the most important for the governor and the state legislature to work on, and for the year? And this year, we found 20% of Californians say immigration is the top issue. So this is in 2017 it was 14%. In 2016, we're in the middle of the drought, so water and the drought was really a top issue there. So this is a nice question because it really does tend to reflect kind of what people are hearing in the news about and really seeing as a major issue that the state needs to tackle. So jobs in the economy, this year we had 9% of Californians saying that that's the key issue, followed by education, state budget, deficit, and infrastructure. All other kind of topics were mentioned by 5% or fewer of respondents. So next we asked about the outlook for the state. We asked if people think that things in California are generally going in the right direction or the wrong direction, and we found that a majority of Californians are actually optimistic about the direction of the state. 57% think it's going in the right direction, 38% the wrong direction. We do have some, as it's coming a trend now, some partisan differences. 76% of Democrats think it's going in the right direction, compared to only a quarter of Republicans who say the same, and about half of independents who think the state is headed in the right direction. I will note that majorities across racial and ethnic groups, with the exception of whites, say that the state's headed in the right direction. We also ask about good times, like looking at the economic conditions in California over the next 12 months. Do we think we'll have good financial times or bad? And again, here we have 56% of Californians are optimistic that we'll have good times over the next 12 months. About a third say we'll have bad times. And we see, again, similar kind of differences among parties. So next we asked a few questions about the governor's budget. So this is a question we've been tracking for a while, which is is the perception of, is the state budget, the situation, a big problem, somewhat of a problem, or not much of a problem? Today we find that 43% of Californians think the budget situation is a big problem. It was slightly lower last January when 37% said it was a big problem, and that was kind of a low point especially since the recession, where we see it was obviously much higher then. Here we go. And also, I'll just notice that Republicans are more likely than Democrats here to say that the budget situation is a big problem. And so we asked a question where we kind of provide a brief summary of the governor's proposed budget. And when we asked about the budget, we found really overwhelming levels of support in terms of 67% of adults, 2/3 of likely voters, Democrats, and majorities across regions and demographic groups favor the governor's budget. Obviously, we do have some partisan differences there. Democrats overwhelmingly favor the budget. Republicans are more likely to oppose than to favor the governor's proposed budget. But among independents, you still have more than 6 in 10 who favor the governor's proposed budget. So we followed up our kind of overall summary, favor, oppose of the governor's proposed budget by asking a question specifically about the $4.6 billion from the recently passed gas tax and vehicle fees increase to repair roads, highways, bridges, commute corridors. And we asked overall if they favor or oppose this proposal to spend this money on these kind of infrastructure repairs. And we found, again, overwhelming support across demographic groups. Among all Californians, 70% favor spending the money from the recent gas tax and vehicle fees increase to repair roads and transportation infrastructure. You do have, again, a big partisan gap there. 80% of Democrats are in favor, whereas 55% of Republicans oppose. But however, when you look at independents, you do have 68% who do favor this proposal. And like I said, across majorities across demographic groups are in favor. So next, we wanted to just kind of generally touch upon the issue that's really kind of been in the news lately about sexual harassment in the state legislature. So first we wanted to gauge if Californians are following this issue, if they're paying attention to news about it. And we saw that 18% of adults say that they're following news about sexual harassment and misconduct in the state legislature very closely. Another 28% are following it fairly closely. One thing I'd like to point out is the likely voters here. So you have, majority of likely voters are following the news about sexual harassment and misconduct at least fairly closely. That compares to only 3 in 10 who are following news about the gubernatorial candidates. So this is, at least among likely voters, they're paying more attention to this issue than, kind of the campaign right now. So then we asked about the other things. We didn't notice a big gender gap. We thought we might see, women paying more attention. We didn't really see that. Similar levels of attention between men and women. So then we asked if Californians approve or disapprove of the way Democratic leaders in the state legislature are currently handling the issue of sexual harassment and misconduct. And we found pretty split here. A quarter don't know, so there's probably, they might want more information or things like that. But we have 39% who approve, 36% who disapprove. And again, we didn't really see any major differences across genders here on this issue either. And finally, we wanted to ask some questions about immigration. Obviously, this is a topic that has been in the news lately with government shutdowns and deals going on in the federal government. So we wanted to ask, this is a question we've asked before, which is, do you favor or oppose this California state and local governments making their own policies and taking actions kind of separate from the federal government to protect the legal rights of undocumented immigrants in the state? And we see that almost 2/3 of Californians favor the state and local governments taking action. Big difference here across parties, as you see. Overwhelming majority of Democrats favor the state and local governments taking such action, compared to only 21% of Republicans. Really a solid majority there of Republicans opposing this. And among independents, they're a little bit more split, though 53% are in favor of the state and local government taking actions to protect undocumented immigrants in the state. So we also wanted to ask specifically about DACA. And so we asked Californians if they favor or oppose the protections given by DACA for immigrants who were brought to the U.S. As children, and the protections would include protection from deportation and a work permit if they passed a background check. And here we see really overwhelming support among Californians. 85% are in favor of the DACA protections, and that includes majorities across parties. So obviously the level of support is not as high among Republicans, but you still have 58% of Republicans who favor the protections offered by DACA. Latinos overwhelmingly favor this, but this is really something that's popular across regions and demographic groups. And so just to kind of review some of the kind of key findings that we found in the survey, Newsom and Villaraigosa are basically in a pretty tight neck and neck tie here in the top two gubernatorial primary. But it's important to keep in mind that a quarter of likely voters are still undecided, and on top of that, not a lot of them are really paying a lot close attention to the news about the gubernatorial candidates. And in the U.S. Senate race, Feinstein continues to lead De Leon by double digits, and again here we have a third of likely voters remain undecided, and 65% of Republicans are undecided on that race. When we look at the repealing the gas tax or the split roll, we really see that likely voters are divided on those two issues right now. But we did find it notable that for the split roll, this was the lowest level of support we've measured since 2012. And for most Californians, they favored the governor's proposed budget, and they think that the state government, at least the legislature and the governor, will be able to work together and accomplish a lot. However, when we look at the federal government, approval ratings are low, and expectations for cooperation between the president and Congress are also low. And many are following closely following news about sexual misconduct in the state legislature, and kind of Californians are somewhat divided here on how Democratic leaders are handling the issue. And immigration really stood out to us as an issue that is a particular concern for Californians, with 20% mentioning it as the top issue for the governor and state legislature to focus on. And we see really solid levels of support across demographic groups and majority support across all parties for the DACA protections. Happy to take any questions anybody might have. Just wait for the microphone here.
Thank you. I have a question about the question that you asked about the spending from the gas tax.
Mm-hmm. See if I go back to that.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how or why, what the question actually says, or how you came up with the formulation. And the reason that I'm confused is because that's what the gas tax and the vehicle fees are supposed to be for. So why are you asking people if they approve spending it? What's the alternative?
Sure. Well, I mean, one alternative is to repeal it, right? So which we asked kind of in the repeal section. We wanted to just know if people, so we have this extra money that we know that is, kind of designated for improvements, transportation infrastructure improvements. We just wanted to gauge to see how, Californians felt about having that money go to that purpose. And we saw that, if having that money there, majorities really support and favor spending it on its, kind of designated purpose for transportation improvements. And the full question wording's available in the back of the survey report, along with the full crosstabs, as Deborah mentioned, are online if you want to have a look.
On the open-ended question, are you surprised that housing didn't make the list? I mean, that's been seems the only thing on the news aside from immigration has been housing.
Yeah, so I think the issue why we don't see housing as high as I think a lot of us would expect is that, there's different ways to ask this question. So this is the one that we asked in January, which is what the state legislature and the governor should be working on. Throughout the year, we also ask what's the most important issue facing the people of California today. If you switch that to, what's the top, issue facing your community, I think that you see then kind of big differences, right? So housing affordability and things like that. There is a certain regional aspect to it to some extent. And so, and I think that with immigration, it's just been in the news so prominently, and a lot of national news as well. So it kind of overtakes, whereas housing, prominent in like California news, maybe not as prominent in national news. So in terms of news consumption, I think immigration's probably a bit more kind of front of mind because of that.
On this question as well, state budget deficit and taxes. Are we talking about pension deficit or perceived pension deficit, or? Because I thought we were in a surplus.
Right. So what we do is well, first of all, there's definitely awareness of the budget situation. Like we saw, 43% still say it's a big problem, right? So a lot lower than when in the recession, when I think everybody knows it's a problem. But you still have a decent chunk of people who see the state budget as an issue. That said, here we aggregate basically mentions of taxes, of state budget and the deficit. So I can break those out, but then they become a lot smaller. But it could be that the majority, I'd have to look, but this could be driven mostly by taxes are too high, or concern about how federal tax law will impact California and things like that.
There's an assumption that we're always in a state of deficit.
Well, I don't know about that. Yeah, you have to, from this question alone, we can't really tell that, but there's definitely a certain percentage of people who are always going to be concerned about the state budget, and we see that when 43% still say that the state budget situation is a big problem. Any other questions?
Thank you, Darian DeLu. I was just wondering, on the expenditures on roads and bridges, I believe it was 40% of the Republicans opposed that?
Let's see, on the spending for the...
Oh, you have
There
it
you go,
there.
yeah.
It was 40% favor it.
Yeah, majority oppose, yeah.
And do you have any further information on that? Are they opposed to all government spending? They're opposed to the
Well,
measure?
They're more likely to favor repealing the gas tax, right? So it could be just an issue of they don't like the gas tax and, thus, therefore don't support the, where the revenue from that increase is going to.
Do you break down the age of the respondents? Do you have a sense of any variation in terms of younger voters, older voters?
Sure. So we waited to be representative of the state population, adult population, and obviously with likely voters, they tend to be older than 18 to 34-year-olds just don't vote as much. But we do have 18 to 34-year-old likely voters in there. And like I said, the full crosstabs are available, including likely voter-only crosstabs, which does have an age breakdown, so you can look, how 18 to 34-year-old voters differ from kind of 55 and older and things like that.
Hi, thanks for all the great info. I had one quick question on the likely voter. Is that for a June turnout model or a November turnout model?
So right now, we're still using our general model, which is kind of high propensity voters, just voters who are typically frequent voters, so voters that we would expect to frequently turn out.
So probably closer to a June
So
turnout
yeah,
model.
so as we get closer to the primary, so probably in our March survey, that's and our surveys leading up to the primary, we're going to switch to a specific model that focuses on likely voters in the primary, and then for the November, then we'll do that for the November election.
Okay, cool. And I also, just in the question about housing, I pulled up your report, and you've got 3% on housing costs and another 5% on homelessness.
Yeah.
And if you put those together,
Yeah.
you get to the issue you were just talking about, like with
Right.
the debts and budgets and all those things.
No, absolutely. And one thing to just note too is among African Americans, the most commonly mentioned issue was actually homelessness. So, obviously, when we're looking at homelessness, we don't know if it's, there's too many homeless or mental health issue, there needs to be more support, or if it's just, kind of housing, tied directly to housing. So But yeah, it's exactly. Sometimes it's, yeah, but it is, you know, you're right. When we combine housing affordability and availability with the mentions on homelessness, it's about 8%. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate you coming out today.